January 22, 1946. Wilton Park, Beaconsfield, Buckinghamshire. The projectionist threaded the film through the 16mm projector in the converted stable block that now served as a lecture hall. 287 German prisoners of war sat in rows of folding chairs, their faces illuminated by dim lights that would soon be extinguished. They had been told this screening was mandatory, non-negotiable, part of the curriculum they had agreed to when selected for this special camp designated as Camp 300. Most expected another propaganda film about British democracy or Allied military victories, the sort of content they had learned to tune out while maintaining expressions of polite attention. What they were about to see would shatter that protective detachment and force many to confront questions about their own complicity in crimes they had dismissed as enemy fabrications. The lights went out, the projector whirred to life, and on the screen appeared footage shot by British cameramen who had entered Bergen-Belsen concentration camp with liberating forces 9 months earlier. The images were almost incomprehensible at first. Emaciated corpses stacked like cordwood, thousands of bodies bulldozed into mass graves, skeletal survivors barely able to stand staring at cameras with hollow eyes that had witnessed horrors beyond articulation. British soldiers wearing masks against the stench of death and disease that permeated the camp. Barracks filled with dying prisoners too weak to move. Children who looked like ancient figures, their bodies reduced to skin stretched over bones. SS guards being forced by British soldiers to carry corpses for burial, their faces showing no remorse, only sullen resentment at being compelled to handle the evidence of their crimes. The footage continued for 37 minutes that must have felt like hours to the prisoners watching in shocked silence. When the lights came back on, the hall remained silent. No one spoke. No one moved. Some prisoners sat frozen, faces drained of color. Others wept openly, shoulders shaking with sobs they could not contain. Still others maintained expressions of stubborn denial, arms crossed defensively, refusing to accept what they had just witnessed as genuine. The silence stretched until Heinz Koeppler, the camp's German-Jewish founder and director who had fled Nazi Germany in the 1930s and now returned to re-educate German soldiers, spoke from the front of the hall. His voice was quiet but carried authority born of moral certainty and personal stake in this reckoning. What you have just seen is not propaganda. It is not staged. It is not exaggerated. This is what was done in Germany's name. This is what the regime you served created. And now you must decide what kind of Germans you will be when you return home. The weight of those words hung in the air, forcing each prisoner to confront a terrible question. What had their service meant? What were they responsible for? Could they ever fully reckon with the complicity their military uniforms represented? The screening was not an isolated incident, but the centerpiece of Britain's most ambitious and controversial experiment in psychological warfare and post-war reconstruction. The systematic re-education of German prisoners of war to transform them from defeated enemies into potential builders of democratic Germany. The program represented a calculated gamble that human beings' political beliefs and moral frameworks were not fixed but could be changed through sustained exposure to alternative ideas, evidence that contradicted propaganda, and intellectual engagement that encouraged critical thinking rather than ideological conformity. It was also a profound expression of British confidence that democratic values were superior not because British propagandists said so but because sustained examination would prove them more humane, more rational, more aligned with human dignity than fascist alternatives. For German prisoners selected to participate, the experience would prove transformative in ways that went far beyond the immediate goal of creating anti-Nazi Germans. The origins of Britain's re-education program lay in recognition that military victory alone would not solve the German problem. British policymakers understood by 1943 that Germany would be defeated militarily, but that defeating Germany in battle did not automatically create stable, democratic Germany afterward. The catastrophic failure of the Treaty of Versailles after World War I had demonstrated that harsh peace terms imposed on defeated nations created grievances that demagogues could exploit to launch new conflicts. British planners were determined not to repeat those mistakes. They envisioned a post-war Germany that would be denazified, democratized, and eventually integrated into a peaceful European order rather than permanently occupied or economically crippled. But how could Germany be transformed from fascist dictatorship into functioning democracy when millions of Germans had been raised under Nazi indoctrination and had no adult memory of democratic governance? The answer, British authorities concluded, was systematic re-education beginning with the most accessible population of Germans under British control. Prisoners of war held in camps throughout Britain. These men would eventually return to Germany and would influence post-war German society in countless ways as workers, teachers, community leaders, fathers raising the next generation. If they could be convinced to reject Nazi ideology and embrace democratic values, they would become agents of transformation within Germany itself, spreading democratic ideas through grassroots networks more effectively than any occupation authority could impose from above. The program was ambitious, bordering on arrogant. It assumed British values were objectively superior and that exposure to those values would convince rational people to adopt them. But it was also pragmatic, recognizing that Germany's transformation required willing German participants, not merely compliant subjects of military occupation. In September 1944, as Allied forces advanced across France toward Germany's borders, the War Cabinet formally approved a re-education scheme to be carried out by the Prisoner of War Division under the Political Warfare Executive, an organization that combined propaganda, psychological warfare, and intelligence operations under civilian and military leadership. Responsibility for the program would later transfer to the Control Office for Germany and Austria as planning shifted from wartime psychological operations to post-war reconstruction policy. The program's aims were explicitly stated in policy documents that have survived in government archives. Eradicate belief in militaristic tradition and Nazi ideology among prisoners, impart understanding of the principles and operation of democratic government, present the British Commonwealth as an example of democratic practice, and correct German misconceptions about recent European history, particularly regarding Germany's responsibility for starting both world wars. The approach was deliberately subtle rather than crude propaganda that would have been dismissed as enemy manipulation. British re-educators understood that direct indoctrination would be counterproductive, triggering defensive reactions from prisoners who had been taught to distrust all Allied communications as psychological warfare. Instead, the program emphasized exposure to information, ideas, and perspectives that had been unavailable in Nazi Germany, allowing prisoners to draw their own conclusions rather than having conclusions forced upon them. This pedagogical philosophy reflected British educational traditions emphasizing critical thinking and independent judgment rather than rote memorization and ideological conformity. It also reflected pragmatic calculation that prisoners who arrived at democratic convictions through their own intellectual processes would be more committed to those convictions than prisoners who merely parroted what they were told to believe. The first step in implementation was systematic screening of prisoners to assess their political sympathies and receptiveness to re-education. Prisoners were interviewed extensively through a process that examined not just explicit political statements but behavioral cues, peer relationships within camps, responses to current events, and intellectual curiosity about ideas beyond Nazi orthodoxy. Based on these interviews, prisoners were classified into 3 categories that would determine their treatment and educational opportunities. White prisoners were identified as anti-Nazi, men who expressed opposition to Hitler's regime through statements, actions, or affiliations. These included pre-war social democrats and communists who had been conscripted despite political unreliability, devout Christians whose religious convictions conflicted with Nazi paganism, intellectuals whose education had exposed them to ideas incompatible with fascism, and ordinary soldiers who had witnessed Nazi atrocities and experienced moral revulsion. White prisoners were prioritized for re-education because they had the least distance to travel ideologically and could serve as role models influencing other prisoners. Gray prisoners had unclear political views or moderate positions that were neither actively Nazi nor clearly anti-Nazi. This was the largest category, encompassing pragmatic Germans who had served the regime without deep ideological commitment, young soldiers who had been raised under Nazi rule and knew no alternative system, and men who were politically disengaged and viewed ideology as irrelevant to their personal lives. Gray prisoners represented the most important target for re-education because they were neither committed Nazis requiring deprogramming nor convinced Democrats needing no conversion. They were persuadable, their beliefs not yet hardened into fixed positions. If re-education could convince Gray prisoners that democracy was preferable to fascism, they would return to Germany as moderate influences resisting both Nazi revanchism and communist revolution. Black prisoners were probable or confirmed Nazis whose loyalty to Hitler and National Socialist ideology remained intact despite military defeat and captivity. Grade C blacks held Nazi sympathies. Grade C+ blacks were ardent fanatics, SS officers, Hitler youth leaders, committed party members who had internalized ideology so completely that they could not imagine alternatives. Black prisoners posed security threats within camps because they attempted to enforce Nazi discipline on other prisoners through intimidation and violence, punishing those who participated too enthusiastically in re-education programs or expressed anti-Nazi views. British authorities separated the most dangerous blacks into specialized maximum security camps like Camp 21 at Comrie, Scotland, where they could be contained and prevented from terrorizing more moderate prisoners. Even black prisoners were exposed to some re-education content, though authorities recognized that deeply committed Nazis were unlikely to change their fundamental beliefs through any educational program. The screening process itself served educational purposes beyond classification. Interviewers asked questions designed to make prisoners think critically about Nazi ideology and Germany's war conduct. Have you considered alternative explanations for why Germany lost? What do you know about conditions in Allied countries versus what German propaganda claimed? How do you reconcile Nazi racial theories with your personal experiences of British treatment? The questions planted seeds of doubt that might germinate over time even if prisoners gave orthodox Nazi answers during interviews. Some prisoners later reported that screening interviews were the first times anyone had asked them to justify their political beliefs rather than simply accepting Nazi orthodoxy as unchallengeable truth. English language courses were systematically organized through programs designated English for All and monitored by English inspectors who evaluated both language instruction quality and the ideological content subtly embedded in lesson materials. Teaching English served multiple practical purposes. It facilitated communication between prisoners and British authorities, prepared prisoners for work assignments that required English skills, and would be valuable when prisoners returned to occupied Germany where English would be essential for interacting with occupation forces and participating in reconstruction efforts. But English instruction also exposed prisoners to British culture, values, and ways of thinking embedded in language itself. Reading materials for English classes included excerpts from British literature, newspapers, and historical documents that presented perspectives on democracy, individual rights, and social organization that contrasted sharply with fascist ideology. Discussions conducted in English about current events required prisoners to engage with Allied interpretations of the war and its causes. Camp 180, designated specifically as a youth camp, opened in July 1946, housed prisoners aged 17 to 26 and offered intensive educational programming tailored to young men who had been raised entirely under Nazi indoctrination with no adult memory of Weimar democracy or pre-Hitler Germany. These youngest prisoners represented both the greatest challenge and the greatest opportunity for re-education. They had known no political system other than Nazism and had absorbed Nazi ideology during their most impressionable years. But they were also less psychologically invested in Nazi victories than older soldiers who had experienced Wehrmacht triumphs from 1939 to 1942. Many young prisoners had been drafted in Germany's desperate final year and had experienced only defeat, retreat, and the collapse of everything they had been told was inevitable German victory. They were disillusioned, confused, and searching for explanations of how the invincible Reich had crumbled so completely. Camp 180's curriculum included intensive courses in languages, particularly English, but also French for prisoners who would return to the French occupation zone. World history presented without Nazi bias or conspiracy theories, citizenship and government examining democratic institutions and their philosophical foundations, and geography situating Germany within broader European and global contexts rather than as isolated victim of foreign conspiracies. Prisoners could earn certifications recognized by British educational institutions, providing credentials that would be valuable for employment in occupied Germany. The educational standards were rigorous, requiring genuine intellectual engagement rather than merely attending classes and parroting correct answers. British educators wanted prisoners who understood democratic principles and could apply them in varied contexts, not prisoners who had simply memorized new propaganda to replace old propaganda. German-language newspapers were distributed throughout the camp system, including Die Wochenpost, published weekly by the British government specifically for prisoners. This publication provided news from war fronts and post-war reconstruction efforts presented from Allied perspectives, cultural content reminding prisoners of German achievements in literature, music, and philosophy that existed independently of Nazi ideology, letters from readers and camp correspondents creating sense of community among prisoners across hundreds of British camps, and editorial content that challenged Nazi narratives through factual reporting rather than crude propaganda. As Germany's military situation deteriorated through 1944 and 1945, Die Wochenpost became increasingly important vehicle for demonstrating that Nazi claims of inevitable victory were false and that Germany was losing the war comprehensively. Articles documented Allied advances with maps showing shrinking territory under German control. Reports from the Eastern Front made clear the devastating Soviet counteroffensive that would eventually reach Berlin. Coverage of Allied bombing campaigns demonstrated destruction being inflicted on German cities. Camp magazines produced by prisoners themselves were encouraged and supported with editorial freedom to discuss topics that would have been forbidden in Nazi Germany. British authorities provided printing equipment, paper supplies when available despite wartime shortages, and editorial guidance that set boundaries against content that threatened security or incited violence, while allowing prisoners remarkable latitude to express diverse viewpoints, including criticisms of Allied policies. The magazines demonstrated that free press could exist without descending into chaos, that open debate about controversial topics strengthened rather than weakened societies, that governments secure in their legitimacy did not need to suppress dissenting voices. Prisoners who produced camp magazines learned practical journalism skills and democratic values of free expression simultaneously. Discussion groups were organized where prisoners could debate ideas without official Nazi Party oversight or fear of denunciation to Gestapo for expressing dangerous thoughts. British authorities facilitated these discussions by providing discussion prompts, moderating to ensure civil discourse, and occasionally participating to offer Allied perspectives while allowing prisoners to argue among themselves. Topics ranged from philosophical questions about human nature and political organization to practical matters about Germany's post-war future and prisoners' roles in reconstruction. The discussions sometimes became heated as prisoners with different political views argued passionately about interpretations and implications. Former Nazi true believers tried to defend ideology against challenges posed by anti-Nazi prisoners and moderates who questioned whether National Socialism had served Germany's interests. These arguments represented democratic process in microcosm, free exchange of ideas, tolerance for disagreement, persuasion through reason rather than force. Film screenings showed documentaries about British democratic institutions, newsreels documenting war's progress and aftermath, and educational content about topics from public health to labor organization. The films were carefully selected to challenge Nazi narratives without appearing to be crude propaganda. Documentaries about British Parliament showed democratic governance in action with real debates, dissenting votes, peaceful transitions of power after elections. Films about British labor unions demonstrated that workers could organize and negotiate with management without state interference, contradicting Nazi claims that democracy meant plutocratic exploitation. Educational films about public services showed that democratic governments provided education, healthcare, and social support, challenging Nazi assertions that only fascist states cared about citizens' welfare. The films were followed by discussions where prisoners could ask questions, express skepticism, and debate what they had seen. Lectures by visiting speakers covered topics ranging from English literature to constitutional history to trade union organization, presented by British academics, politicians, labor leaders, and intellectuals who volunteered to engage with German prisoners. The speakers represented diverse political perspectives within British democratic spectrum, conservatives, labor, liberals, demonstrating that democracy accommodated multiple viewpoints and that political disagreement did not require violence or suppression. Some speakers had opposed British entry into the war initially, showing that dissent from government policy did not make one a traitor. Others had been conscientious objectors during World War I, demonstrating that democracies tolerated moral objections to military service. The diversity of voices contradicted Nazi claims that democracies were monolithic plutocracies where capitalist elites controlled all discourse. But the centerpiece of British re-education efforts was Wilton Park, designated as Camp 300, a dedicated re-education center at Beaconsfield in Buckinghamshire that operated from January 1946 to August 1948, conducting 15 intensive courses for approximately 4,000 German prisoners. Roughly 300 prisoners per course lasting several months each. The facility was housed in a requisitioned country house with classrooms, library, dormitories, and grounds suitable for accommodating prisoners in residential educational environment, rather than conventional security-focused camp. Selection for Wilton Park was competitive. Prisoners had to be screened as white or gray, demonstrate intellectual curiosity and engagement, commit to participating fully in rigorous curriculum, and sign agreements that they would not attempt escape or sabotage during their time at the facility. Many prisoners eagerly sought selection for Wilton Park despite or perhaps because of its intensive educational demands, viewing it as opportunity to understand what had happened to Germany and to prepare for post-war futures in ways conventional camp life did not provide. The facility was founded and directed by Heinz Koeppler, a figure whose personal history embodied both the tragedy of Nazi Germany and the possibility of reconciliation through democratic re-education. Koeppler was born in Germany in 1912, earned doctorate in history from University of Berlin in 1935, and worked as lecturer and scholar until Nazi racial laws made his position untenable because of his Jewish heritage. He fled Germany in 1938, settling in Britain where he worked as language teacher and educational consultant, while watching his homeland descend into barbarism from which he and millions like him had been expelled. When war came, Koeppler joined British intelligence services, working on German-related operations that utilized his language skills, cultural knowledge, and passionate commitment to defeating Nazism. But Koeppler understood that military defeat alone would not solve the German problem. Germany needed to be transformed, not merely conquered, and that transformation required Germans who understood what had gone wrong and were committed to building a different kind of Germany. Koeppler proposed establishing intensive residential re-education center where carefully selected German prisoners could be immersed in democratic education over extended periods. His proposal was accepted in late 1945, and he was given authority to design curriculum, select staff, and direct operations with remarkable autonomy, reflecting British confidence in his judgment despite his German origins. Koeppler's position was complicated and emotionally fraught. He was a German Jew educating German soldiers who had served the regime that had persecuted him and murdered millions of his co-religionists. Yet he approached the work without personal vengeance, believing that most German soldiers were not individually responsible for Nazi crimes and could be redeemed through education that exposed them to truth and challenged them to think critically about what they had supported. He insisted on treating prisoners with respect, engaging them as intellectual equals capable of understanding complex ideas and making moral choices, not as children to be lectured or criminals to be punished. The format at Wilton Park combined formal lectures with seminars and Oxford-Cambridge-style tutorials that encouraged critical thinking and debate rather than passive absorption of information. Each day included morning lectures by visiting speakers or Koeppler himself introducing topics and providing frameworks for analysis. Afternoons were devoted to small group seminars where prisoners discussed morning lectures, raised questions, debated interpretations, and applied concepts to specific historical examples or contemporary situations. Evenings featured tutorials where individual prisoners or very small groups met with instructors for intensive discussion of reading assignments, written work, and personal intellectual development. The schedule was exhausting intellectually, demanding sustained concentration and engagement far beyond what conventional camp life required. Prisoners sometimes complained about the workload, but most recognized they were receiving university-level education from world-class scholars, an opportunity most would never have had in civilian life. Distinguished guest lecturers at Wilton Park included some of Britain's most prominent intellectuals, politicians, and public figures who volunteered their time to engage with German prisoners in experiment they found fascinating and morally important. Bertrand Russell, the philosopher and mathematician who had revolutionized logic and written extensively on political philosophy, lectured on rational thought, individual liberty, and the philosophical foundations of democratic governance. His arguments that political systems must be judged by how they treat individuals rather than how they serve abstract collectives challenged Nazi emphasis on racial communities superseding individual rights. Russell engaged prisoners in Socratic dialogue, asking questions that forced them to examine assumptions they had accepted unthinkingly and to recognize contradictions in Nazi ideology. When Russell asked prisoners, if individual rights matter less than racial community, whose judgment determines what the community requires, he forced them to recognize that this logic justified any tyranny provided it claimed to serve collective good. William Beveridge, architect of Britain's post-war welfare state and author of the influential Beveridge Report that became blueprint for National Health Service and expanded social insurance, lectured on social democracy and how democratic governments could provide economic security without resorting to totalitarian control. His vision of comprehensive social welfare, funded through progressive taxation and delivered through democratic institutions, challenged Nazi claims that only fascist states cared about workers' welfare. Beveridge demonstrated that democracy and social justice were compatible, indeed mutually reinforcing, contradicting Nazi propaganda that democracies were inherently plutocratic systems benefiting only wealthy elites. He presented data showing how British social insurance programs had expanded access to healthcare, education, and retirement security without sacrificing individual liberty or economic efficiency. Lady Astor, the first woman to serve in the British Parliament, lectured on democratic representation, women's rights, and the evolution of British democracy to include previously excluded groups. Her presence challenged Nazi ideologies about women's proper sphere being limited to children, kitchen, and church. Lady Astor's political career demonstrated that democracy expanded opportunity rather than constraining it, that progress came through peaceful advocacy and electoral politics rather than violent revolution. She spoke frankly about Britain's own historical failures, including unequal suffrage and class barriers, demonstrating that democracies acknowledged imperfections and worked to reform them rather than claiming infallibility. Her willingness to critique her own society while defending democratic principles showed prisoners that democratic commitment did not require blind nationalism. Richard Crossman, Labour politician and intellectual who would later serve in post-war governments, lectured on socialist thought and how democratic socialism differed from both fascist corporatism and Soviet communism. Crossman challenged prisoners to understand that opposing Nazism did not mean embracing either unregulated capitalism or totalitarian communism, that democratic socialism offered third way combining economic justice with political freedom. His lectures complicated prisoners' tendency to view politics as binary choice between extremes, exposing them to sophisticated political theory about how societies could be organized to balance liberty and equality. Crossman spoke passionately about how British labor movement opposed both Nazi fascism and Soviet totalitarianism, arguing that working people deserved both economic security and political freedom rather than having to choose between them. A.J.P. Taylor, the historian whose work on German history and origins of World War II would become influential in shaping post-war understanding, lectured on European history from perspectives that challenged Nazi historiography. Taylor argued that German militarism predated Hitler, that Germany bore significant responsibility for World War I as well as World War II, that Nazi claims of German victimization by Versailles Treaty ignored Germany's own war guilt and aggressive aims. His lectures forced prisoners to confront uncomfortable historical truths about Germany's role in European conflicts, rather than accepting comfortable Nazi narratives of eternal German innocence and foreign conspiracy. Taylor presented evidence showing how German political elites had pursued militaristic foreign policies consistently across decades, demonstrating that Nazi aggression was not aberration but continuation of deeply rooted patterns. Arnold Toynbee, the scholar of civilizations whose multi-volume A Study of History examined rise and fall of great civilizations across millennia, lectured on patterns of civilizational decline and whether Germany could recover from Nazism's catastrophic failures. Toynbee's comparative approach, situating Germany within broader patterns of human history, gave prisoners perspective that transcended immediate circumstances. He argued that civilizations declined when they lost moral purpose and became focused on power for its own sake, that Germany's future depended on whether Germans could recover moral foundations and recommit to values beyond tribal nationalism. His lectures challenged prisoners to think beyond Germany's immediate reconstruction to longer-term questions about what kind of civilization Germany would contribute to. Toynbee provided historical evidence that civilizations that had committed atrocities and faced defeat had sometimes recovered through conscious moral renewal and recommitment to universal values rather than tribal advantage. The guest lectures were voluntary attendance officially, but prisoners at Wilton Park understood that participation in all programming was expected as condition of their selection. The lectures attracted nearly universal attendance not because of coercion, but because prisoners found them intellectually stimulating and directly relevant to questions they were grappling with about Germany's future and their own roles in it. Prisoners could ask questions during and after lectures, challenge speakers' arguments, demand clarification of points they found confusing or unconvincing. The speakers engaged these challenges seriously, treating prisoners as intellectual equals whose objections deserved substantive responses rather than dismissal. When one prisoner challenged Bertrand Russell, arguing that Nazi ideology had provided Germans sense of purpose and community lacking in liberal democracies, Russell responded by asking whether purpose rooted in genocide could ever be morally defensible, forcing the prisoner to confront implications of his argument. But no component of the Wilton Park curriculum was more powerful or more controversial than the forced screenings of films showing liberation of Bergen-Belsen and Buchenwald concentration camps. All German prisoners, not just those at Wilton Park, were required to attend screenings of concentration camp footage as mandatory component of re-education. British authorities determined that confronting German prisoners with undeniable visual evidence of Nazi atrocities was essential for breaking through denial and forcing moral reckoning with what had been done in Germany's name. The footage had been shot by military cameramen who accompanied liberating forces into camps in April and May 1945, documenting conditions they encountered in detail that would provide irrefutable evidence for future war crimes prosecutions. The Bergen-Belsen footage was particularly horrifying because the camp had continued receiving prisoners even as Allied forces approached, creating catastrophic overcrowding and disease that killed thousands in the final weeks before liberation. British cameramen documented scenes almost beyond human comprehension. Emaciated corpses stacked in piles awaiting burial, survivors so weakened by starvation and disease that they could barely move, mass graves filled with thousands of bodies, SS guards forced by British soldiers to handle corpses and face consequences of their actions. The film showed systematic evidence of genocide, facilities designed for efficient murder, documentation of victims by nationality and supposed crime, systematic theft of prisoners' belongings, complete dehumanization of victims reduced to numbers and categories. Children were shown who appeared to be nothing but skin stretched over skeletons, infants who had died from starvation and neglect. The footage made clear that Holocaust was not spontaneous violence or isolated excesses but systematic program of extermination. The Buchenwald footage included testimony from survivors describing starvation, random executions, medical experiments, forced labor that worked prisoners literally to death. It showed facilities including crematoria where bodies were disposed of, barracks where prisoners had been packed in unconscionable conditions, torture equipment used for extracting confessions or simply inflicting suffering for guards' entertainment. It documented the liberation process itself, American soldiers' shock and horror at what they found, medical personnel's desperate efforts to save survivors despite inadequate supplies, the insistence on documenting everything photographically so that no one could later deny what had happened. The footage made undeniable that Nazi regime had created industrial system of mass murder that had killed millions. Prisoner reactions to concentration camp footage varied but followed certain patterns documented by camp administrators, psychologists observing screenings, and prisoners' own accounts recorded years later. Initial reactions ranged from shock and horror among those genuinely unprepared for the images, through skeptical denial from those convinced the footage must be propaganda fabrications or exaggerations, to sullen acceptance from those who had suspected or known about camps but had not confronted their full horror. Many prisoners reacted physically. Some vomited, others fainted, still others sat frozen, unable to process what they were seeing. The footage struck at fundamental level that transcended intellectual argument, forcing visceral confrontation with evil that could not be rationalized or minimized. In the days and weeks following screenings, prisoners grappled with implications through private reflection, discussions with fellow prisoners, and interactions with British educators and guards. Some prisoners immediately accepted the footage as genuine evidence of Nazi crimes and experienced profound moral crises as they confronted their own participation in regime that had committed such atrocities. Even prisoners who had not personally participated in Holocaust questioned whether their military service and general support for Nazi government made them complicit in crimes committed under that government's authority. These prisoners sought atonement through rejection of Nazi ideology, commitment to democratic values, and determination to help build Germany that would never again descend into barbarism. One prisoner, Major Dieterstam, wrote in his personal diary that watching concentration camp footage had shattered his ability to view Nazi regime as serving German interests, that he now understood himself as having been instrument of criminality regardless of his personal intentions. Other prisoners went through stages of denial before eventually accepting the footage's authenticity. Their initial reaction was to dismiss everything as Allied propaganda designed to demoralize German prisoners and justify harsh peace terms. But sustained exposure to evidence, additional footage, testimony from camp survivors, documents captured from SS archives, simple logical impossibility of faking footage on such scale, gradually broke down denial. British educators challenged deniers with questions they could not answer satisfactorily. If the footage was fake, how did Allies create such elaborate sets showing thousands of corpses? Where did they find people willing to be filmed in such degraded states? Why would guards confess to crimes during war crimes trials if those crimes never occurred? The questions accumulated until denial became untenable and prisoners were forced to confront horrifying reality. Still, other prisoners never fully accepted the footage's authenticity or its implications, even when they could not refute evidence. These prisoners retreated into compartmentalized thinking that allowed them to acknowledge camps existed while minimizing their significance or spreading blame beyond Nazi regime. They argued that all nations committed atrocities during war, that Allied bombing of German cities was comparable moral crime, that Stalin's purges and gulags proved Allied hands were no cleaner than German hands. This moral equivalence allowed them to avoid confronting unique horror of systematic genocide designed to eliminate entire peoples. British educators challenged these rationalizations but recognized that some prisoners' psychological investment in Nazi ideology was too deep to overcome through any educational program. The concentration camp screenings represented most controversial aspect of re-education program because they deliberately inflicted psychological distress on prisoners in service of broader educational and moral goals. Some observers both during the war and in subsequent years criticized the screenings as cruel psychological manipulation that violated Geneva Convention provisions against subjecting prisoners to humiliating treatment. Critics argued that forcing prisoners to watch horrific footage served no legitimate educational purpose but merely satisfied Allied desire for vengeance by traumatizing German prisoners. Defenders countered that the screenings were essential for breaking through denial and complacency that had allowed Nazi crimes to occur, that Germans who would return home to rebuild their nation needed to confront truth about what had been done in their name, that temporary psychological distress was justified cost of moral education that might prevent future genocides. The controversy reflected broader tensions in Allied occupation policy between punishment and rehabilitation, between holding Germans collectively responsible for Nazi crimes and treating ordinary Germans as victims of Nazi manipulation who could be redeemed. British re-education ultimately came down on side of rehabilitation rather than punishment, but rehabilitation required acknowledging crimes before moving beyond them. The concentration camp screenings served that acknowledging function, forcing recognition that could not be avoided or minimized. Whatever their psychological cost, they achieved their intended effect of making denial impossible and forcing moral reckoning with Nazi Germany's greatest crimes. A psychological observer noted that the most profound changes in prisoners' attitudes occurred not when they initially viewed the footage but in subsequent weeks as they processed what they had seen and integrated it into their understanding of reality they had previously accepted. Beyond the concentration camp footage, Wilton Park's curriculum included extensive study of recent European history examining how Germany had arrived at Nazism and catastrophic defeat. British and German émigré historians taught courses that challenged Nazi historical narratives point by point, documenting how Nazi propaganda had distorted historical facts to serve ideological purposes. Prisoners studied World War I's origins, examining complex alliance systems, imperial rivalries, and militaristic cultures that had driven European powers toward conflict. They examined Versailles Treaty objectively rather than through lens of Nazi grievance, learning that while treaty terms were harsh, they were not unprecedentedly brutal, and German conduct during war had provoked Allied determination to prevent future German aggression. They studied how German hyperinflation in 1923 had been result of German rearmament spending and refusal to comply with reparations rather than French vindictiveness as Nazi propaganda claimed. They studied Weimar Republic's failures, analyzing economic crises, political polarization, and social tensions that had created conditions for Nazi rise, but also learning that Weimar democracy had been undermined deliberately by extremists on both left and right who rejected democratic compromise. They examined Nazi seizure of power, recognizing that Hitler had not been democratically elected, but had manipulated constitutional provisions and used political violence to establish dictatorship. They learned that Weimar voters had never given Nazis electoral majority. At the party's peak in 1932, Nazis received 37% of the vote. Most Germans voted for other parties, Yet Hitler had seized power through backroom dealings with conservative elites who believed they could control him. They studied Nazi foreign policy, seeing how Hitler's territorial ambitions and ideological fanaticism had made World War II inevitable despite repeated Allied efforts to preserve peace through appeasement. The historical education gave prisoners factual grounding that contradicted Nazi mythology and provided foundation for understanding how Germany had gone so catastrophically wrong. The Braintree experiment in 1947 brought re-educated prisoners to observe British democratic institutions firsthand through arranged visits to police stations, courtrooms, factories, trade union meetings, and other venues where democratic governance and civil society functioned in practice rather than theory. Prisoners witnessed criminal trials where defendants received legal representation and verdicts were determined by juries of ordinary citizens rather than by party-controlled judges. They visited factories where workers elected shop stewards and negotiated with management over pay and conditions without state interference. They attended trade union meetings where workers debated policies and elected leaders through competitive elections. They observed police constables patrolling without weapons, relying on public cooperation and rule of law rather than fear and coercion. They visited public schools where children were taught to think critically rather than memorize propaganda. They toured Parliament, viewing debates where politicians disagreed sharply, voted against their own government, and accepted electoral defeats without violence. The visits demonstrated that democratic institutions they had studied theoretically actually functioned in real world, that democracy was not merely propaganda slogan but operating system of government and society that produced tangible benefits for ordinary citizens. Prisoners could ask workers, police officers, teachers, and others they encountered about their experiences, hearing first-hand testimony about how democracy worked from people who had no reason to lie since they were not government propagandists but ordinary Britons going about daily lives. The Braintree visits were eye-opening for prisoners who had been taught that democracies were chaotic failures where plutocratic elites exploited masses. Instead, they witnessed orderly societies where citizens participated in governance, where disputes were resolved through law rather than violence, where government derived legitimacy from consent of governed rather than coercive power. One prisoner, Franz Müller, later reported that attending British trade union meeting had been revelation. He had never imagined workers could organize independently without government permission, negotiate with employers without state mediation, strike if negotiations failed without fear of execution. Participation in most re-education activities was voluntary in sense that prisoners could not be forced to attend lectures or participate in discussions under Geneva Convention rules prohibiting coercive indoctrination. British authorities worked within these constraints by making re-education programming attractive through quality instruction, interesting guest speakers, and tangible benefits including educational certifications and improved living conditions at facilities like Wilton Park. They also created social pressure through prisoner classification system that rewarded participation with designation as white or gray prisoners eligible for better work assignments and earlier repatriation. The combination of attraction and social pressure ensured high participation rates without technically violating Geneva Convention provisions. The educational quality was sufficiently high that participation became genuinely voluntary in practical sense. Prisoners wanted to attend lectures and discussions because they found the content engaging and intellectually stimulating. One component that was mandatory and non-negotiable was attendance at concentration camp footage screenings. British authorities determined that confronting Nazi atrocities was so essential to moral re-education that it justified overriding voluntary participation principles. Prisoners who refused to attend screenings faced disciplinary consequences including extended captivity and ineligibility for desirable work assignments. The mandatory nature of screenings reflected British judgment that some moral education was too important to be left to individual choice, that Germans returning to rebuild their nation needed to confront truth about Nazi crimes whether they wanted to or not. This paternalistic approach was controversial but reflected determination that Germany's transformation required unpleasant moral reckoning with past. Koeppler defended the mandatory screenings, arguing that prisoners who had benefited from Nazi regime's material support had moral obligation to confront what that regime had done, that denying themselves discomfort of watching concentration camp footage was trivial price compared to suffering of victims. The effectiveness of re-education programs has been debated by historians examining whether they actually changed prisoners' political beliefs or merely taught prisoners to express democratic sentiments while maintaining private Nazi sympathies. Measuring ideological transformation is inherently difficult because beliefs are internal states that cannot be directly observed, and because prisoners had incentives to express democratic views publicly regardless of private convictions, since doing so improved treatment and accelerated repatriation. Contemporary assessments by British observers were generally positive, noting that many prisoners showed genuine intellectual engagement with democratic ideas, and that their participation in discussions suggested authentic grappling with questions rather than mere performance of democratic sentiment. Observers noted that prisoners who had been most skeptical of re-education programming often became its most enthusiastic participants, suggesting that intellectual engagement overcame initial defensive reactions. Post-war tracking of Wilton Park graduates provided some evidence of lasting impact. Many former prisoners maintained correspondence with Koeppler and British educators who had taught them, returning to Britain for reunions and continuing intellectual engagement with democratic ideas years after repatriation. Some became prominent figures in West German politics, journalism, education, and civil society, where they advocated for democratic values and European integration. Former prisoners interviewed decades later consistently cited Wilton Park as transformative experience that had exposed them to ideas and perspectives they had never encountered in Nazi Germany. They described the program as having opened their minds, challenged assumptions they had accepted unthinkingly, and provided intellectual tools for understanding how Germany had gone wrong and how it might rebuild better. One former prisoner, Heinz, who became prominent newspaper editor in West Germany, stated in 1980 that Wilton Park experience had literally changed the course of my life, teaching me that democracy was not weakness but strength, that individual freedom and national prosperity were compatible rather than contradictory. The Masch Commission, a West German government body established in 1960s to study the fate of German prisoners of war in Allied custody across all theaters, conducted extensive research including interviews with former prisoners, examination of camp records, and analysis of post-war careers of re-educated prisoners. The Commission's findings were published in multi-volume report that has become primary source for scholarly study of German POWs. Regarding British re-education specifically, the Commission concluded that none of the powers made such a decisive effort as Great Britain to assist Germany's return to a free and democratic European group of nations. This assessment from German government authority with access to extensive documentation and no incentive to flatter British policies provides strong evidence that re-education had significant positive impact. The Commission specifically noted that German prisoners who had been held in Britain and participated in re-education programs demonstrated significantly higher commitment to democracy and European integration in post-war years compared to prisoners held in Soviet custody or those who had not participated in educational programs. An anonymous ex-prisoner writing in 1960s stated in German publication, "One notices constantly in every serious conversation who had the luck to be a prisoner of war in Britain. I write the word luck quite intentionally because, believe it or not, it is today here in West Germany considered an advantage to have been a prisoner of war in Britain." This remarkable statement suggests that British captivity, including re-education programs, had become seen within West Germany as beneficial experience rather than merely unfortunate consequence of military defeat. The perception that British captivity was fortunate reflected both humane treatment prisoners received and intellectual exposure to democratic ideas that proved valuable in post-war German society, where such ideas were essential for participation in reconstruction and European integration. Ex-prisoners frequently advanced in West German society to positions where they could influence post-war development, and many attributed their success to educational foundation provided by British re-education programs. Resistance from hardcore Nazis to re-education efforts demonstrated the limits of educational programs for changing deeply held ideological commitments. In camps holding black prisoners, particularly Camp 21 at Comrie designated for most fanatical Nazis, re-education programming faced active sabotage and intimidation. Black prisoners who maintained loyalty to Hitler and Nazi ideology viewed re-education as enemy psychological warfare designed to break their will and undermine German resistance. They refused to participate in programming, disrupted lectures and discussions, and threatened white and gray prisoners who engaged enthusiastically with democratic education. The atmosphere in black prisoner camps was more similar to Nazi prison camps than to British custody, with fanatical Nazis enforcing ideological conformity through threat of violence and social ostracism. The December 1944 murder of Wolfgang Rosterg at Camp 21 illustrated the violent potential of ideological fanaticism even in captivity. Rosterg was suspected by 5 fellow prisoners of betraying escape plans to British authorities. The accusers subscribed to Nazi principle that traitors deserved death regardless of circumstances, and they executed Rostrug in his barack using a noose fashioned from available materials. British authorities investigated, identified the 5 perpetrators through witness testimony and physical evidence, and prosecuted them in British military court. All 5 were convicted of murder and hanged at Pentonville Prison in October 1945. The incident demonstrated that some prisoners remained so committed to Nazi ideology that they would commit murder to enforce Nazi discipline even when their regime had been utterly defeated. It also demonstrated British commitment to justice. Murder was prosecuted regardless of perpetrators or victims' nationality, and rule of law prevailed over any temptation to allow prisoners to police themselves or to accept vigilante punishment as normal part of camp life. British authorities learned from incidents like Rostrug murder that separation of fanatical Nazis from moderate prisoners was essential for both security and effective re-education. Black prisoners who remained at Camp 21 and similar facilities received minimal re-education programming since authorities recognized they were unlikely to change and resources were better invested in white and gray prisoners who might be receptive. The fanatics were contained, prevented from spreading their ideology or intimidating others, and eventually repatriated to Germany where they would be subject to denazification efforts by occupation authorities. Some hardcore Nazis never abandoned their beliefs, maintaining loyalty to Hitler until their deaths decades later. Their resistance demonstrated that no educational program could reach everyone, that some ideological commitments were too deeply rooted to be dislodged through exposure to alternative ideas. Yet the fact that even fanatical Nazis were contained rather than brutalized demonstrated British commitment to humane treatment as principle rather than merely pragmatic necessity. The long-term impact of British re-education programs extended beyond individual prisoners to influence West German political culture in post-war decades. Former prisoners who had been exposed to democratic ideas and institutions at Wilton Park and other camps returned to Germany with intellectual frameworks for understanding democracy that most Germans lacked after 12 years of Nazi dictatorship. They became teachers who educated the next generation, journalists who shaped public discourse, politicians who built democratic institutions, business leaders who operated within rule of law rather than through party connections and corruption, and ordinary citizens who supported democratic norms because they had seen democracy work effectively even under stress of total war. Their stories carried more persuasive power than any occupation policy because they were accounts of Germans who had experienced democracy firsthand and found it preferable to totalitarianism. West Germany's successful transition to stable democracy resulted from multiple factors including American Marshall Plan aid that rebuilt economy, Soviet threat that created unity in Western alliance, wise leadership from figures like Konrad Adenauer, and genuine German desire to reject Nazi past. But among those factors was the experience of hundreds of thousands of German soldiers who had witnessed democratic institutions functioning during their captivity in Britain and America. They had seen that democracy was not chaos but orderly system of governance, that democratic values were not weakness but source of strength, that societies based on rule of law and individual rights could be prosperous and stable. This experiential knowledge provided foundation for democratic culture that could not be imposed through occupation policy alone but required German acceptance and participation. The prisoners who returned to Germany as advocates of democracy carried conviction born of personal experience that proved more persuasive than abstract arguments or propagandistic assertions. The contrast between British and Soviet treatment of German prisoners created natural experiment in political psychology whose results influenced entire Cold War era. German prisoners who returned from British custody generally integrated successfully into West German society, often expressing gratitude for their treatment and maintaining positive views of Britain and democratic values. German prisoners who survived Soviet captivity, and hundreds of thousands did not survive the brutal conditions in Soviet camps, returned traumatized, broken in health, and carrying deep hatred for communism based on direct experience of Soviet brutality. This division of experiences reinforced ideological divide between East and West Germany and contributed to West Germany's firm alignment with Western alliance and democratic values. The approximately 1.8 million German prisoners captured by Soviets experienced starvation, disease, executions, and forced labor that killed approximately 400,000 of them, a mortality rate approximately 25 times higher than in British captivity. The brutality ensured that survivors who returned to Soviet zone were predisposed toward Western values and profoundly resistant to Soviet authority. The legacy of British re-education extended even to modern Wilton Park, which transitioned after 1948 from prisoner of war facility to continuing educational institution, focused on international dialogue and conflict resolution. Modern Wilton Park hosts conferences bringing together government officials, academics, journalists, and civil society leaders from around the world to discuss international challenges ranging from security threats to environmental issues to democratic governance. The institution maintains its founding commitment to dialogue, critical thinking, and belief that exposure to diverse perspectives can change minds and build understanding across divides. The continuity from Heinz Koeppler's original vision to modern institution demonstrates enduring value of educational approaches to international problems. Contemporary leaders who participate in Wilton Park conferences often credit the experience with providing new perspectives and building relationships that facilitate cooperation on intractable problems. The institution remains committed to principle that understanding through dialogue is preferable to conflict through violence or coercion. The moral dimension of British re-education policy deserves examination separate from its strategic utility. British authorities made deliberate choice to treat defeated enemies not merely as security threats to be contained, but as human beings capable of moral and intellectual growth who could be transformed through education. This choice reflected British confidence in democratic values, confidence strong enough to expose those values to critical examination rather than merely asserting them as unchallengeable truth. It reflected British patience to invest years of effort and substantial resources in programs whose benefits would only become apparent long after war ended. And it reflected British vision that lasting peace required not merely military victory but transformation of enemy societies from within through voluntary embrace of democratic principles by citizens who understood why those principles served human dignity better than totalitarian alternatives. This long-term vision contrasted sharply with Soviet approach that emphasized punishment, forced labor, and deliberate brutality toward German prisoners as just deserts for Nazi crimes. Soviet treatment extracted maximum economic value from prisoner labor while deliberately maintaining harsh conditions that killed hundreds of thousands through starvation, disease, exposure, and overwork. Conditions in Soviet POW camps were calculated to terrorize and destroy rather than educate and reform. British approach prioritized prisoner welfare and education over economic extraction, gambling that investment in re-education would pay long-term dividends through creation of democratic Germany that would be stable partner rather than permanent threat. History vindicated British approach. West Germany became prosperous democracy and NATO ally while East Germany remained totalitarian police state until communist system collapsed in 1989. The re-education of German prisoners of war in British custody represents one of history's most ambitious and successful experiments in using education to transform enemies into potential allies. It demonstrated that political beliefs and moral frameworks are not fixed, but can be changed through sustained exposure to alternative ideas, evidence that contradicts propaganda, and intellectual engagement that encourages critical thinking. It showed that treating defeated enemies with dignity and investing in their education serves long-term interests better than punishment and exploitation. And it proved that democratic values are strong enough to survive critical examination and persuasive enough to convince rational people through evidence and argument rather than coercion. For the 4,000 prisoners who passed through Wilton Park and the hundreds of thousands who participated in broader re-education efforts across British camps, the experience provided intellectual tools and democratic commitment that would shape their lives and influence Germany's post-war trajectory. They returned to devastated Germany carrying memories of concentration camp footage that forced moral reckoning with Nazi crimes, exposure to democratic institutions that demonstrated viable alternatives to totalitarianism, relationships with British educators and fellow prisoners that challenged racial ideologies, and hope that Germany could rebuild as democratic nation integrated into peaceful European order. Those memories, multiplied across thousands of individual lives, contributed to West Germany's transformation from fascist dictatorship into stable democracy in ways that occupation policies alone could never achieve. The re-education experiment succeeded not by forcing beliefs but by opening minds, not by demanding compliance but by encouraging thought, not by punishing past but by preparing future.